The sun was an anvil, and the silence of the high plains was the hammer. It beat down on Jedediah Thorne, on his worn leather hat, on the broad shoulders of his dusty coat, and on the land itself. The prairie grass, already bleached to the color of old bone, shimmered in the heat, stretching in every direction until it met a sky so vast and empty it seemed to swallow the sound of a man's own breathing. This was the world Jedediah had chosen, a world of stark and brutal beauty, a place where a man could work until his muscles screamed for mercy and his mind was too tired to wander down the dark, familiar paths of memory. His homestead was a testament to this life of disciplined solitude, a single sturdy cabin built of hand-hewn logs, chinked tight against the wind, a small barn that smelled of hay and horse, a corral with 2 steady geldings who were more his partners than his property. Everything had its place, every hour its purpose. He rose before the sun painted the eastern mountains in hues of rose and lavender, his first act to stoke the embers in the stone fireplace, the ritual of making coffee, the grinding of the beans, the smell that filled the small, one-room cabin was the one small comfort he allowed himself. After that, the day was a succession of tasks that never ended, mending the split-rail fence that marked his claim, checking on his small herd of longhorn cattle, clearing stones from the stubborn patch of earth he hoped would one day be a proper garden. He ate his meals alone, sitting at the rough plank table he had built himself. The food was simple: jerky, beans, sourdough bread he baked twice a week. The silence was a constant companion. Sometimes, in the dead of winter when the snows locked him in for days, the quiet would press in on him, so heavy he felt he might suffocate. But it was a silence of his own making, preferable to the echoes of laughter and soft voices that haunted the hollows of his heart. He was a man in his late 30s, but the grief he carried had carved lines around his eyes and mouth that made him look older. His hands were calloused and capable, able to soothe a nervous horse or set a splinted bone with equal care. He moved with a deliberation that spoke of a man who had learned not to waste a single motion, a single thought. This quiet competence was a wall he had built around himself, brick by painstaking brick, to keep the past at bay. But the past was a persistent ghost. It would rise unbidden in the smallest moments. The sight of a small, bright wildflower blooming stubbornly by a fence post would bring a sudden, sharp image of his daughter, Sarah, her little hands clutching a fistful of Indian paintbrush, her face alight with the simple joy of color. She would have been 10 now. He would stop his work, his breath catching in his throat, his gaze lost on the horizon until the ache in his chest subsided to its usual dull throb. He would see his wife, Martha, in the way the evening light slanted through the cabin's single window, remembering how it used to catch the soft brown of her hair as she sat mending his shirt by the fire. Her hands had been so gentle, her smile a quiet warmth that had made this harsh land feel like a home. He never spoke their names aloud. To say them would be to give the grief a shape, a power he could not bear to confront. They had been taken by the cholera, a swift and merciless thief that had swept through the small settlement they had tried to build a life in. He remembered the fever, the helplessness, the scent of sickness that clung to everything. He had held Martha's hand as her strength faded, had cradled Sarah's small, still body, his own heart turning to a cold, heavy stone in his chest. After he had buried them side by side on a small rise overlooking the creek, he had sold his claim, packed his wagon, and headed west. Seeking a place so empty there would be no room for ghosts, he had found it here, in this vast and indifferent landscape that asked nothing of him but survival. This afternoon, the sun was particularly cruel. He was riding the southern edge of his property, checking for breaks in the fence line where a stray steer might wander off. His horse, a buckskin named Dust, plodded along, its head low. The air was thick with heat, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and the buzz of insects. It was in this profound stillness that he heard it. At first, it was just a flicker of sound, thin and reedy, almost carried away by the faint breeze. A coyote pup, perhaps, or a hawk. He reined Dust to a halt, listening, his head cocked, The sound came again, clearer this time. It was a cry, a child's cry. It was a sound of pure desperation, a knife-sharp wail that cut through the afternoon's torpor. A cold dread trickled down his spine. He nudged Dust forward, his eyes scanning the landscape. The cry led him away from the flat prairie and towards a jumble of rocky outcrops, weathered sandstone formations that rose from the earth like broken teeth. This was not a place he often rode. It was bad land, full of gullies and snakes. As he drew closer, Dust grew skittish, his ears twitching, his nostrils flaring. Jedediah dismounted, looping the reins around a scrubby branch. He drew the colt from his hip, its weight a familiar comfort in his hand, and proceeded on foot. The cries were louder now, punctuated by words in a language he did not recognize. But the tone was universal. It was a plea. He rounded a large boulder and stopped dead. The scene before him was so horrific it took his mind a moment to process it. A woman was tied to a flat-faced rock. Her arms were stretched high above her head, her wrists bound tight with thick rope that had dug deep into her flesh. Her ankles were bound to a smaller rock at the base. She was Apache. That much was clear from her high cheekbones, her dark skin, and the tattered remnants of a deerskin dress. She was exposed entirely to the merciless sun, her skin blistered and peeling, her lips black and cracked. Her head was slumped forward, her long, dark hair matted with dust and sweat. She was barely conscious, her body occasionally twitching in a spasm of agony. She had been left here to die a slow, torturous death. Standing before her, a small, fierce guardian, was a boy of about 6. He was trying to shield her face from the sun with his own small body, casting a pathetic sliver of shade. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, but his dark eyes, fixed on Jedediah, held a defiant fire. He held a sharpened stick in one hand like a spear. "Help her!" the boy pleaded, his voice a raw rasp. He spoke a few words of broken English mixed with the desperate sounds of his own tongue. "Please, Mommy is tied. Please help her!" Jedediah's first instinct was caution, a cold, hard knot of it in his gut. This was Indian trouble, the kind of trouble that could get a man killed. The settlers and the Apache were locked in a bitter, bloody struggle for this land. To interfere was to choose a side, and in this country, choosing the wrong side was a fatal mistake. His mind screamed at him to back away slowly, to get on his horse and ride, to pretend he had seen nothing. His quiet life, the sterile peace he had so carefully constructed, depended on it. He could not, would not get involved. But then his eyes met the boy's. He saw the raw terror there, the desperate hope, the fierce love that kept him standing guard over his dying mother. And in that moment, the boy was not an Apache. He was just a child. Jedediah saw the ghost of his own daughter in those dark, pleading eyes. He remembered the feeling of utter powerlessness as he had watched his own family suffer, unable to do a thing to stop it. The wall he had built around his heart began to crumble. He could not save Martha and Sarah, but he was here now, and this woman, this child, were not yet gone. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a grim resolve. He holstered his pistol, a sign of peace, and took a slow step forward. The boy flinched but held his ground. Jedediah pulled the large Bowie knife from the sheath on his belt. The boy's eyes widened in fresh terror, and he raised his small stick. "I am going to cut her free," Jedediah said, his voice low and calm, hoping the tone, if not the words, would be understood. He moved past the boy to the rock. The stench of sun-baked sweat and misery was strong. He reached up and sawed at the thick ropes binding the woman's wrists. The fibers were tough, and he had to put his weight into it. The rope finally snapped, and her arms fell limply to her sides. He moved to her ankles and cut the other bonds. Freed! Her body had no strength left. She crumpled forward, a dead weight. Jedediah lunged and caught her before she hit the ground. She was lighter than he could have imagined. a fragile bundle of bones, her skin burning with fever. She moaned, a sound so faint it was like the whisper of dry leaves. He lowered her gently to the ground, into the shade of the boulder. The boy was instantly at her side, touching her face, murmuring to her. Jedediah uncorked his canteen. "Water," he said, holding it out. He lifted the woman's head and tipped a small amount of water onto her cracked lips. At first, there was no response. Then her tongue darted out, and her eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain and confusion, but they were alive. He gave her more. She drank with a desperate, greedy thirst, choking and gasping, until the canteen was nearly empty. The small act of drinking seemed to sap the last of her energy. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she lost consciousness completely. Now came the momentous decision. He could not leave them here. They would not survive another hour in this heat. The nearest town, Redemption, was a day's ride, and they would find no mercy there. The only place was his homestead. Bringing them there, an Apache woman and her child, was an act of profound recklessness. It was inviting the very trouble he had spent years avoiding. It was an end to his solitude. He looked down at the unconscious woman, at the raw, bleeding wounds the ropes had made. He looked at the small boy, who now watched him not with defiance, but with a fragile, desperate hope. The choice had already been made. He walked back to his horse. "We are going to take her home," he said to the boy. Getting her onto Dust's back was a difficult task. He had to lift her with care, his muscles straining. He draped her over the saddle, her head and arms hanging on one side, her legs on the other. It was an undignified way to travel, but it was the only way. Then he mounted the horse, settling himself behind the saddle. "Come," he said, reaching a hand down to the boy. The boy hesitated for only a second before taking Jedediah's hand. Jedediah swung him up, placing him in the small space between his chest and the saddle horn. The boy was small and wiry, and he immediately wrapped his arms around the horn, his small body trembling. The ride back was slow and silent. Jedediah held the reins in one hand, his other arm instinctively resting on the boy's back, steadying him. He could feel the child's heart beating like a trapped bird's. A silent truce had been born of pure necessity. With every plodding step the horse took, Jedediah felt his isolated world receding further into the past. When they arrived at the homestead, the sun was beginning to dip towards the mountains, casting long shadows across the prairie. The cabin, which had always seemed a sufficient shelter, now felt impossibly small. He dismounted and gently lowered the woman from the horse, cradling her in his arms. She was still unconscious. He carried her inside and laid her down on his own bed, the one he had shared with Martha so long ago. The sight of her dark hair spread across his simple pillow sent a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar through him. He turned to the boy, who had slid off the horse and followed him inside, a silent shadow clinging to the doorframe. "She will be all right?" Jedediah said, though he was not sure if he believed it. For the next hour, he worked with a focused intensity. He stoked the fire and put a kettle of water on to boil. He tore strips from a clean linen sheet, creating bandages. He gently washed the dust and grime from the woman's face and arms. Then, with a soft cloth and warm water, he began to clean her wounds. The rope burns on her wrists and ankles were raw and angry, rubbed down to the bleeding flesh. There were cuts and deep bruises on her arms and back, marks of a terrible struggle. His touch was practical, his movements efficient. Yet there was a gentleness to them that spoke of a man who was no stranger to caring for the injured. All the while, the boy, Taza, watched. His wide, dark eyes missed nothing. He stood by the bed, never moving more than a few feet from his mother, his small face a mask of suspicion and fear. He was a sentinel, guarding the last thing he had in the world. When Jedediah had done all he could, bandaging the wounds as best he was able, he stood up and realized his own hunger. He cut a piece of jerky and offered it to the boy. Taza stared at the meat, then at Jedediah's face, and shook his head. Pressing himself closer to the bed, Jedediah understood. He placed the jerky, along with a tin cup of water and a piece of bread, on the small crate that served as a nightstand beside the bed. Then he walked to the other side of the cabin and sat down in his chair by the hearth, turning his back to give them a measure of privacy. He ate his own meal in silence, listening. After a long while, he heard the faint sound of the boy chewing. As night fell, a deep chill settled over the plains. The woman's fever began to climb. She started to toss and turn, her body caught in the grip of nightmares. Words tumbled from her lips, spoken in her native tongue, the phrases sharp with pain and terror. She cried out names he did not know, her hands clenching the rough blanket. Jedediah did not sleep. He sat a long vigil in his chair, the fire casting flickering shadows on the log walls. The cabin, once his fortress of solitude, was now filled with the ragged breathing of a sick woman and the quiet fear of her child. Every hour or so, he would rise, dip a rag in a bucket of cool well water, and gently lay it on her forehead. She would quiet for a time under his touch before the fever dreams took her again. The boy had finally curled up on the floor by the bed, wrapped in a spare blanket, but his sleep was fitful, and he whimpered whenever his mother cried out. Outside, the wind moaned around the corners of the cabin, a lonely sound in an endless darkness. But inside, for the first time in years, Jedediah Thorne was not alone. The isolation he had cultivated so carefully had been breached. This small, fragile cabin had become a sanctuary, a fragile bubble of warmth and light against the cruel, indifferent world that lay just beyond the door. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that nothing would ever be the same. The fever broke just before dawn, not with a violent shudder, but like a slow tide receding from a parched shore. For 3 days and nights, Nita had been lost in its burning country, a landscape of disjointed, terrifying memories. Now, consciousness returned as a thin, gray light filtering through the cracks in a log wall. She was aware of the profound weakness in her limbs, the dull ache in her wrists and ankles, and a thirst that felt like a fire in her throat. The air smelled of unfamiliar things, pine smoke, the bitter tang of coffee, and the faint, clean scent of lye soap. She lay on something soft, covered by a rough but warm blanket. This was not the familiar feel of a buffalo robe on the hard-packed earth of a wickiup. A deep, instinctual alarm went off inside her. She forced her heavy eyelids open. The cabin was small and shadowy. A stone hearth held the glowing red heart of a fire, and sitting in a chair near it, his profile etched by the flames, was a man, a white man. Fear, cold and absolute, seized her. The fragmented memories of the last days rushed back. The attack on her camp, the brutal faces of the men, the searing sun, the ropes. This man was one of them. He had to be. Her first, overwhelming instinct was not for herself, but for her son. "Taza?" she rasped, her voice a dry whisper. A small shape stirred on the floor beside the bed. Taza, his face smudged with sleep and old tears, scrambled to her side. He pressed his face into her shoulder, his small body a warm, solid reality. Nita wrapped a weak arm around him, pulling him close. Her body was a broken shield, but it was all she had. Her eyes now clear and sharp, with a mother's ferocity, locked onto the man by the fire. She was ready to die, but she would die protecting her son. Jedediah saw the moment she woke. He had been watching her breathing change, seeing the tension of the fever leave her face. He saw the terror in her eyes as she looked at him, and he understood it. He did not move from his chair, knowing any sudden motion would only heighten her fear. He simply held her gaze for a moment and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The fever's gone," he said. His voice kept low and even, the way a man speaks to a spooked horse. "You need to eat. Get your strength back." He rose slowly, his movements measured, and went to the iron pot hanging over the fire. He ladled a thin, savory-smelling broth into a wooden bowl. He did not approach the bed. Instead, he placed the bowl on the small crate beside her, alongside a cup of fresh water. Then he retreated to the far side of the cabin, picked up a piece of harness, and sat down to mend it, creating a wide, unthreatening space between them. Nita watched his every move. She saw the deliberate way he kept his distance. She saw that his hands, though large and calloused, were occupied with a simple, peaceful task. He was not looking at her, but she felt his awareness of her. Her instincts screamed danger, but what she saw was something else. Patience. Still, she did not trust him. She did not trust any of them. She whispered to Taza in her own tongue, asking if the man had hurt him. The boy shook his head, telling her the quiet man had given them food and water and had tended to her while she slept in the fire sickness. He had not been unkind. Slowly, hesitantly, Nita pushed herself up. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she leaned against the rough-hewn wall behind the bed. She took the bowl of broth. It was made from rabbit, she could tell, and flavored with wild roots she recognized. It was the food of survival. She guided the spoon to Taza's mouth first, and only after he had taken some did she drink a little herself. The warm liquid was a balm to her raw throat, a small anchor in a sea of confusion and fear. In the days that followed, a fragile truce settled over the small cabin. Communication was a thing of gestures and intuition. When Jedediah brought in firewood, he would ask with a raised eyebrow if she was cold. She would give a slight nod or shake of her head. When he cooked, he would hold up a potato or an onion, and she would indicate her assent. The silence between them was thick, but it was no longer the silence of pure hostility. It was a silence of observation, of waiting. Taza became the unwitting bridge across the chasm that separated their two worlds. The resilience of childhood began to wear away at his fear. He was fascinated by Jedediah's quiet, methodical routine. He would watch, wide-eyed, as Jedediah sharpened an axe or cleaned his rifle. The cabin was small, and the boy's curiosity soon led him to the doorway, and then to the small, sun-drenched patch of dirt just outside. He never went far, always keeping his mother in his line of sight, a small satellite orbiting the center of his universe. One morning, Jedediah went out to the corral to groom Dust. Taza followed, keeping a safe distance, his small hands clutching the doorframe. Jedediah began to brush the buckskin's flank with long, even strokes, speaking to the animal in a low, soothing murmur. He saw the boy watching, his dark eyes full of a longing curiosity. Jedediah held out the curry comb. Taza flinched back. Jedediah did not press. He simply ran the bristles of the brush gently over his own forearm to show it would not hurt. Then he turned back to the horse. After a few moments, Taza took a tentative step forward, and then another. He reached out a small hand and took the offered brush. Jedediah knelt, his large hand gently covering the boy's, guiding him. "Easy now," he said softly. "Just nice and slow. He likes that." Together, they made a few strokes along the horse's powerful flank. The animal stood placidly, twitching its skin in contentment. A small, tentative smile touched Taza's lips from the cabin doorway. Nita watched. She saw the patience in the white man's hands, the gentleness in his voice as he spoke to her son. It was a stark contrast to the brutality she had known. This man was a puzzle she could not yet solve. As her own strength returned, Nita's pride would not allow her to remain helpless. The first day she felt steady on her feet. She found the sewing kit Jedediah had left on the table. She took up her torn deerskin dress and began to repair it with small, neat stitches, her hands remembering the familiar, comforting rhythm of the work. Soon, she began to take on other tasks. While Jedediah was outside, she would sweep the packed earth floor with a makeshift broom. She learned where he kept his supplies and began to help prepare their simple meals, adding wild greens and roots she recognized from the creek bed. They moved around each other in the small space, two solitary creatures learning a strange, silent dance of cohabitation. She learned the rhythm of his life, and he, hers. She saw the profound loneliness in him, a quiet, aching sadness that he tried to hide behind his work, and he saw in her a fierce, unbending spirit that had refused to be broken by unspeakable cruelty. The day came when Jedediah looked into the nearly empty flour sack and knew he could put it off no longer. He had to go to redemption. The thought filled him with a cold dread. Leaving them alone was a risk, but going to town, he knew, was an even greater one. The world outside this small, isolated homestead was not a kind place. He tried to explain with gestures, pointing to the empty sack, then pointing east, towards town. "I have to go," he said, his voice grim. "For food, supplies." Nita's eyes became guarded. She understood. Town was where the other men, the cruel men, were. Before he left, Jedediah made sure they would be safe. He chopped a large pile of firewood and stacked it just inside the door. He filled 2 large buckets with fresh water from the well. Then he did the one thing that conveyed his intentions more than any words could. He took his Winchester rifle down from its pegs on the wall. He worked the lever, checking the chamber. It was loaded. He turned to Nita and held it out to her. "Stock first." She stared at the weapon, then at his face. For a white man to arm an Apache was an act of unimaginable trust, or unimaginable foolishness. It was a choice. He was choosing to trust her. Her hand was steady as she took the rifle. Its weight was solid, balanced. She knew weapons. She nodded once, her eyes meeting his. It was a silent promise. She would protect her son, and she would protect this place. The ride to redemption was long and hot, and Jedediah felt the hostile eyes of the land on him. When the town finally came into view, a single, dusty street lined with ramshackle buildings under the oppressive sun, it felt more like a threat than a refuge. He tied dust in front of Miller's general store and stepped inside. The store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dust. A few men were gathered around the stove, though it was not lit. When Jedediah entered, their conversation died. All eyes turned to him. Mr. Miller, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, gave him a curt nod. Jedediah gave his order in a low voice. Flour, beans, salt, coffee, a side of bacon. The necessities. Then he hesitated. "And a bolt of that blue calico," he added, pointing to a roll of fabric on a high shelf. "And thread to match." Miller's eyebrows shot up. Every man in the store heard, Jedediah Thorne, the hermit who bought nothing but the barest of essentials, was buying dress fabric. The air thickened with unspoken questions. As Miller was measuring out the fabric, the bat-wing doors of the saloon across the street swung open and a group of men strode out. At their lead was Silas Croft. Croft was a man who owned things, the biggest ranch in the territory, the saloon, and most of the men in town. He was large and fleshy, but there was a hardness in his small, pig-like eyes. He carried his power like a weapon. He and his men had already been drinking. They saw Jedediah's horse and changed course, heading straight for the store. Jedediah finished his business, paid in cash, and carried his sacks outside. Croft and his men were waiting for him, blocking his path. "Well now, Thorne," Croft said, his voice a smug, rumbling drawl. "Didn't figure to see you in town. Things must be getting lonely out there on that sorry patch of dirt you call a homestead." Jedediah said nothing, his face a granite mask. He started to move towards his horse. One of Croft's men, a lanky cowboy with a cruel mouth, stepped in his way. "We heard some news. Thorne, heard one of them Apache squaws we was teaching a lesson to got herself loose. You ain't seen nothing like that out your way, have you?" The men chuckled. Jedediah felt a cold, hard rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. My land has been quiet. Silas Croft's gaze fell upon the bolt of calico tucked under Jedediah's arm. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. Is that so? Quiet enough you decided to take up sewing? Or maybe you got some company we don't know about. The implication was as sharp and ugly as a rusty nail. Jedediah looked directly at Croft, his blue eyes as cold as a winter sky. My business, he said, each word spaced with quiet menace, is my own. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. The dusty street was silent save for the buzzing of flies. Croft was weighing the man before him. He saw no fear, only a deep, unmovable resolve. Finally, Croft gave a short, ugly laugh. Have it your way. Thorn. But this is my country, and I don't take kindly to folks who harbor renegades. You remember that. He stepped aside. Jedediah loaded his supplies, swung himself onto Dust's back, and rode out of town. He did not look back, but he could feel the hatred of the entire town boring into his spine. He had seen the venom in their eyes. This was not over. The ride home was heavy with a new kind of dread. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and purple. The homestead, when he finally saw it, no longer looked like a simple sanctuary from his own ghosts. It looked like a fortress, a small, vulnerable outpost in the heart of a hostile wilderness. He pushed open the cabin door, weary to his bones. He was met not with the familiar, stark emptiness, but with a sense of order. The small room was clean. His tools were arranged neatly on a shelf he had never bothered to clear. The fire was burning steadily, and a pot was simmering over it, filling the cabin with the scent of wild herbs and stewing meat. Nita had taken his solitary space and made it into something that felt, strangely, like a home. She was sitting on the floor by the fire, her hands busy weaving something. Taza was asleep, curled in a blanket on Jedediah's bed. When she heard him enter, she looked up and then stood, her face impassive. They looked at each other across the small room. He saw the question in her eyes, the question of what he had brought back from the world of men. He gave a slight shake of his head, a silent message that the danger was not yet upon them. Then she held out her hand. In her palm lay a small, perfect figure woven from the golden prairie grass that grew by the creek. It was a horse, its head high, its tail arched, every detail rendered with impossible skill. He set his supplies down and took the small horse from her. It was light as a feather, yet it felt substantial in his calloused hand. It was a gift, an act of grace, the first beautiful thing to enter his life in a very long time. It was her way of saying thank you, a message that crossed the gulf of language and culture between them. He looked from the intricate, woven figure to her face. Her dark eyes were solemn, still guarded, but for the first time, he saw something else there, something beyond the fear and the pain. He saw a flicker of understanding, an acknowledgement of their shared predicament, their shared humanity. He gave a small, stiff nod of thanks. In the quiet of the cabin, with the wind rising outside, this silent exchange felt more meaningful than any words he could remember. A thread, fragile but strong, had been spun between them. The weeks bled into one another, measured not by the calendar but by the slow, steady rhythm of sun and moon, work and rest. A tentative routine, fragile as a spider's web, began to form, connecting the three solitary figures into something that resembled a life. They were a small, isolated island of existence in the vast, indifferent sea of the prairie. Jedediah would rise in the pre-dawn grayness, his movements quiet so as not to disturb the others. But more often than not, Nita was already awake, her silhouette a dark, graceful shape against the pale eastern sky. She had claimed a small patch of earth near the cabin, and with a sharpened stick and relentless effort, she was coaxing life from the stubborn soil, planting the seeds of wild squash and beans she had carried in a small pouch. The garden became her domain, a place where she could cultivate a future. however uncertain. Taza, now free from the grip of constant terror, became Jedediah's shadow. As Jedediah split logs for the fire, the boy would stand nearby with a smaller branch, mimicking the powerful swing of the axe. When Jedediah went to check on his cattle, Taza's small legs would pump furiously to keep pace with the man's long, unhurried stride. A quiet, unspoken affection grew between them. Jedediah would carve a small, simple whistle from a piece of willow for the boy, and Taza would leave a smooth, interesting stone he had found by the creek on Jedediah's workbench, for a man who had thought his heart was buried forever with his daughter. The weight of the boy's small hand slipping into his was a feeling so poignant it almost hurt. The cabin itself had changed. It was no longer just a man's austere shelter. A string of dried herbs now hung from the rafters, filling the air with a faint, pleasant scent. Nita's woven grass horse sat on the mantelpiece, a companion to the worn wooden one Jedediah kept there. The space was clean, ordered, and in the evenings, when the fire was lit, it held a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. Their trust was built not on words, but on the sharing of essential knowledge. Jedediah took Taza into the brush and taught him the patient art of tracking. He showed him how the bent blade of grass, the faint scuff in the dust, the placement of a dropped feather could tell the story of a rabbit's passing. He taught the boy how to set a simple snare, not as a game, but as a crucial lesson in the hard calculus of survival. It was the knowledge a father would pass to a son, and in teaching Taza, Jedediah felt a part of himself he had thought long dead stir to life. In return, Nita began to reveal the secrets of the land that Jedediah had only ever seen as an adversary. One afternoon, he gashed his hand badly on a piece of rusted wire. The cut was deep and dirty. Without a word, Nita left the cabin and returned with a handful of broad, green leaves. She chewed them into a poultice and applied it to the wound, binding it with a clean strip of cloth. The poultice had a clean, sharp smell and a drawing coolness. Within a day, the angry redness around the cut had faded, and it began to heal cleanly, without festering. She showed him which berries were safe to eat, which roots could be boiled to make a tea that would soothe a cough, and which mushrooms would bring a swift and painful death. She was teaching him her language of the earth, and he, a pragmatic man, listened with a newfound respect. She was not a victim he had rescued. She was a woman of profound wisdom and strength. With this growing trust came the slow crumbling of the wall of silence. They began to teach each other words, the building blocks of a new, shared world. It started simply. Jedediah would point. "Table," he would say, his voice slow and clear. Nita would repeat the word, then offer her own. Itza, Taza, a quick and eager student, would repeat both, cementing the connection. Their vocabulary grew day by day. Horse, fire, bread, sun, moon, rain. Soon they moved from objects to ideas. Nita would touch the faded scar on her arm and say the Apache word for pain. Jedediah would look out at the vast, empty prairie and teach her the word quiet. Through this halting exchange, fragments of their former lives began to emerge. He learned the name of her son was Taza, which meant giant in her tongue, a name given in hope. She learned that the wooden horse on the mantel had belonged to a little girl. They were piecing together the ghosts of each other's pasts, one broken word at a time. The past came crashing into the present on a cool evening in late autumn. The wind howled outside, a lonely sound, but inside the cabin, a tentative peace had settled. Jedediah was mending a bridle, the scent of leather oil filling the air. Nita was sewing a patch onto Taza's worn leggings. Taza himself, feeling bold, stood on a stool to get a closer look at the two horses on the mantelpiece, the one of woven grass and the one of wood. He reached out a small finger and touched the wooden one, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. He looked at Jedediah, his dark eyes full of childish curiosity. "This horse?" he asked, his new English still clumsy. "Who for?" The simple question struck Jedediah like a physical blow. The all in his hand stilled. The air in the cabin seemed to grow thin and cold. Nita looked up from her sewing, sensing the sudden, profound shift in the room. For a long moment, Jedediah did not speak. He stared at the small wooden toy as if it were a ghost, the wall he had so carefully built around his heart, the one made of silence and hard labor, suddenly had a gaping hole in it. He set down his leatherwork and walked to the fireplace. He picked up the horse, his large thumb stroking the curve of its neck. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the moan of the wind. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with disuse, thick with an old, unspent sorrow. It was for my daughter. The word a daughter was a stone in his throat. Her name was Sarah. He turned, the horse held loosely in his hand, and looked at Nita and Taza. He had to tell them. He had to give this ghost a name. Haltingly at first, then with a flood of words held back for too many years. He told them everything. He spoke of Sarah, a bright, laughing child with her mother's brown hair. He told them how he had carved the horse for her in secret, working on it by candlelight for weeks before her 5th birthday. He described the look on her face when she saw it, a joy so pure it had felt like the sun rising inside his own chest. Then he spoke of his wife, Martha. He told them of her quiet strength, her gentle hands, the way she could make a home out of nothing but grit and love. He did not describe a grand passion, but a deep, steady partnership that had been the anchor of his life. His voice grew flat and hard as he came to the end of the story. He spoke of the sickness that had come on the wind, a fever that burned through their small settlement like a prairie fire. He described the helplessness, the utter, soul-crushing powerlessness of watching the two people he loved most in the world waste away before his eyes. He had been strong, capable, a man who could tame the land and build a life with his bare hands. But against this invisible enemy, he had been nothing. "I could not stop it," he said, the words a confession of his deepest failure. "I could do nothing." He fell silent. The story told, he stood there, stripped bare of his stoic armor, a man hollowed out by grief. The wooden horse in his hand felt impossibly heavy, a relic from a life that no longer existed. Nita had listened without moving, her dark eyes never leaving his face. She had seen men's anger, their cruelty, their greed, but she had never seen a white man's sorrow. In the raw, aching pain of his story, she heard an echo of her own. His vulnerability was a bridge, an offering of a shared, broken humanity. He was not just a white man anymore. He was a man who had lost everything, just as she had. When the silence had settled, she placed her sewing aside. She began to speak, her voice low and steady. Her broken English was a clumsy tool for such a story, so she wove in her own words, her hands shaping the narrative with gestures of love and violence and loss. Jedediah listened, understanding not every word, but every ounce of the meaning. She told him of her people, who lived by the singing river. She spoke of her husband, Black Hawk, a hunter so skilled he could move through the forest without snapping a twig, a father who had woven cradle boards for his children with his own hands. She described her life with him and their infant son, Taza, a life of balance and ceremony, governed by the seasons. Her voice lost its softness as she spoke of the day the world ended. The Yellow Rock Men, she called them, had come. They were led by the big man with the cruel face, the man Jedediah had faced in town, Silas Croft. They did not want to trade. They wanted to know the location of a sacred place, a place they believed held gold. When her people refused, the men returned with rifles. It was not a fight, she explained. It was a slaughter. She spoke of it with a chilling, detached calm, the way a person describes a terrible storm they have somehow survived. She told him how she saw Black Hawk fall, an arrow still clutched in his hand, his body riddled with bullets. She described how she grabbed Taza and ran for the river, but Croft on his big horse had run her down. Her voice dropped to a whisper. and she stared into the fire as she recounted the final horror. Croft had been angry that she fought back, that she had dared to scratch his face with her nails. He said he would make an example of her. He had his men drag her to the rocks, away from the smoke and screams of her dying village. He had tied the ropes himself, his breath hot and foul on her face, telling her the sun would finish what he started. When she finished, the cabin was utterly still. The two terrible stories lay between them, two monuments to unbearable loss. In the flickering firelight, they were no longer a man and a woman from warring worlds. They were two souls shipwrecked on the same desolate shore, their hearts broken by the same brutal hand of fate. Later that night, sleep was an impossible dream. Jedediah's mind was a maelstrom of old grief and new rage. He pulled on his boots and went outside, needing the cold, clean air to breathe. The sky was a vast sweep of black velvet, punctured by the diamond-sharp light of 1,000,000 stars. The sight, usually a comfort, offered none tonight. It only made him feel smaller, his pain a meaningless speck in the uncaring cosmos. A faint sound made him turn. Nita was standing in the doorway, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She, too, had been driven from the cabin by the ghosts their stories had awakened. She walked slowly towards him, stopping a few feet away. They stood together in the immense silence of the prairie night, two solitary figures under the endless stars. He saw the faint glimmer of a tear as it traced a path down her cheek. That single, silent tear undid him completely. All the loneliness he had carried for years, all the sorrow he had buried under relentless work, surged to the surface. Without thinking, he reached out his hand, his calloused fingers, accustomed to the roughness of rope and wood, were surprisingly gentle as they touched her skin, brushing the tear away. His hand lingered there, on the curve of her cheek, a simple human touch in the vast emptiness. The space between them crackled with an energy that was more than just sorrow. It was a desperate, aching need for solace, for the comfort of another soul who knew the geography of pain. In the profound darkness of her eyes, he saw his own grief reflected. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of tenderness or romance. It was a kiss of raw, desperate need. It was harsh and searching, full of the salt of their shared tears, the grit of their survival. It was a kiss of profound loneliness and a spark of impossible hope. It was a silent, desperate question and a silent, desperate answer. It was an acknowledgement of all the broken pieces of their lives, and the wild, unthinkable chance that those pieces might somehow fit together. The morning after the kiss was a country of its own, a silent, unfamiliar landscape that lay between them. The air in the small cabin, which had grown thick with a comfortable, shared rhythm, was now charged with a humming tension. They moved around each other like strangers, their usual easy proximity replaced by a stiff and awkward distance. Every mundane act, stoking the fire, fetching water, grinding coffee, was freighted with a new and heavy significance. Jedediah found he could not look at her directly. When he tried, the memory of the previous night would rush back, the impossible softness of her skin under his rough hands, the raw, desperate taste of her lips, the profound sorrow in her eyes that had mirrored his own. He felt a confusing mix of relief and terror. A door he had nailed shut and barricaded years ago had been thrown wide open, and he did not know what to do in the sudden, blinding light. He retreated into the one thing he understood: hard, physical labor. He took his axe and went to the woodpile, throwing himself into the work with a grim fury, trying to exhaust the turmoil from his mind and body. The rhythmic thud of the axe-splitting wood was the only conversation he was capable of having. Nita, too, was adrift in the aftermath. The kiss had been a cataclysm, shattering the careful composure she had pieced together since her rescue. It had been a moment of pure, undiluted connection, a solace she had never expected to feel again. But in the cold light of day, it felt like a dangerous betrayal of the life she had lost, of the husband who had died defending her. She was an Apache woman. He was a white man. Their worlds were at war. To feel anything for him was to stand on a cliff edge, with a chasm of blood and history yawning below. She kept Taza close, her hands busy with mending and cooking, but her mind was far away, lost in the new and perilous territory of her own heart. Taza, with the simple intuition of a child, sensed the strange current running between the two adults and remained quiet, his usual chatter subdued. The day wore on, a long, silent testament to all that was unspoken. The pretense of normalcy was a thin sheet of ice over deep, turbulent water, and by late afternoon, it was beginning to crack. Jedediah returned from his work, his hands raw, his body aching, but his mind no quieter than it had been at dawn. The cabin felt empty, a prickle of cold fear, sharp and immediate, went through him. He checked the garden, the barn, the corral. She was gone. He found her down by the creek, in a secluded hollow shaded by whispering cottonwood trees. She was standing at the water's edge, so still she might have been a statue carved from the riverbank stone. She was staring into the slow-moving current as if searching for an answer in its murky depths. Her shoulders, usually held with such resilient pride, were slumped. For the first time since he had known her, her formidable strength seemed to have faltered, leaving her looking small and terribly lost. He approached slowly, the crunch of his boots on the pebbled shore announcing his presence. She did not turn. The day of strained silence and avoidance had been a fool's errand, an attempt by both of them to deny what was now an undeniable truth. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back. He came to stand beside her. For a long while, they both just watched the water flow, the silence between them no longer tense, but filled with a heavy resignation. Finally, she turned her head to look at him. Her dark eyes were a maelstrom of confusion, sorrow, and a question that needed no words. He answered it by reaching out and taking her hand. Her fingers were cold, but they curled around his, a silent surrender. He did not speak. Words were useless now. He gently pulled her away from the creek, leading her deeper into a hidden grove of aspens whose white trunks stood like silent, ancient sentinels. The leaves overhead trembled in the breeze, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of sunlight and shadow. Here, in this secret, hidden place, the world and its harsh judgments seemed to fall away. There was only the rustle of the leaves, the warmth of the afternoon sun, and the two of them. He stopped and turned to face her, lifting his other hand to cup her cheek. He looked deep into her eyes, and what he saw there was a reflection of his own soul, a landscape scarred by loss, but with a stubborn, desperate will to live. He lowered his head and kissed her again. This time, it was not the raw, frantic kiss of the night before. It was deep and sure, an exploration and a claiming. And when they came together on a soft bed of fallen leaves, it was an act of profound and passionate defiance. It was not a gentle union, but a fierce and intense one. A desperate affirmation of life in the very shadow of death. For Nita, it was a reclaiming of a body that had known only violence and pain, a discovery that touch could be a source of solace and not suffering. For Jedediah, it was an awakening of a heart he had long believed to be dead and buried, a shattering of the lonely solitude he had mistaken for peace. In the quiet sanctuary of the grove, they found in each other a momentary, breathtaking refuge from the world. Their love, once acknowledged, became the secret heart of their life on the homestead. It unfolded in the spaces between the necessary chores of survival, in a language of stolen moments. It was in a shared glance over the rim of a coffee cup in the morning, a silent conversation that no one else could understand. It was in the way his hand would brush against hers as he passed her the water bucket, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of warmth through them both. It was in the quiet evenings after Taza was asleep, when they would sit by the fire, their shoulders touching, and share the real stories of their lives, their triumphs and their follies, filling in the vast empty spaces of each other's pasts. In the darkness of the cabin, they would find each other, their bodies learning a new language of comfort and desire, Their lovemaking was a healing balm, a fierce and tender act that mended the broken places in their souls. But with every touch, with every shared secret, the danger grew. Their love was a flickering candle in a vast, dark wilderness, a precious and beautiful thing that the slightest wind from the outside world could extinguish forever. And the wind was beginning to blow. The outside world intruded first as a distant menace. One afternoon, Jedediah was on the low ridge that overlooked his northern pasture when he saw them, a line of 5 riders, dark shapes moving slowly against the horizon. Even from a mile off, he recognized the confident, arrogant posture of the man on the lead horse, Silas Croft. They were not heading towards the cabin. Not yet. They were riding his property line, a slow, deliberate patrol. It was a message. I know you are there. I am watching. For several days, the patrol continued. The riders were a constant, menacing presence on the edges of their world. Jedediah's jaw was perpetually tight, his hand never far from the pistol on his hip. Nita would watch them from the cabin window, her face a grim, unreadable mask. The homestead no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage. Then the psychological warfare escalated to open aggression. Jedediah rose one morning to an unnatural silence from the pasture. A deep sense of foreboding led him out towards the northern fence. He found her there, one of his best young heifers, lying in a crumpled heap. The animal's throat had been cut, the ground around it a dark, muddy stain. It was a brutal, wasteful act of violence, a clear and savage message from Croft. This is what I can do. This is what I will do. A cold, clean rage settled in Jedediah's heart. He knew then, with absolute certainty, that a violent confrontation was no longer a possibility, but an inevitability. A few days later, the second attack came, this one more insidious. The water he drew from the well had a foul taste and a sickening odor. He lowered a lamp down the shaft and saw the bloated, floating body of a dead rabbit. They had poisoned his well, the very source of their life. It was an act of profound violation, meant to drive them out, to make their small fortress uninhabitable. That night, the quiet work of fortification began. Jedediah was no longer just a rancher trying to live in peace. He was a man preparing for a siege by the light of a lantern. He hammered thick planks of wood over the cabin's 2 smaller windows, leaving only narrow slits to see and shoot through. He forged a heavy iron bar and brackets to reinforce the main door from the inside. He spent hours cleaning his rifle and pistol, methodically checking his limited supply of ammunition, his movements economical and grim. Nita refused to be a helpless bystander, a prize to be fought over. She was a survivor, and she would be a warrior. She unearthed a longbow from the back of the barn, a relic Jedediah had taken in a trade years ago and forgotten. The wood was seasoned yew, the string old but serviceable. There were a half-dozen arrows with it, their feathers dry and brittle. In her hands, the bow was not a relic, it was a living thing. She restrung it, her movements fluid and sure. She began to practice in the early mornings, down by the creek where the sound would not carry. Her skill was breathtaking. Her stance was rooted to the earth, her draw smooth and powerful. The arrow would leave the string with a soft hiss and strike a small, knotted branch 100 feet away with a solid, deadly thud. She was not the woman he had cut from the rock. She was a hunter, a protector. Her spirit as sharp and true as the flint arrowheads she painstakingly crafted. She, in turn, began to teach him. While he knew how to fight with a rifle and his fists, she knew how to fight with the land itself. She showed him how to melt into the tall prairie grass, how to use the shadows of the rocks for cover. She taught him to listen, not just with his ears, but with his whole body, to understand the sudden silence of the crickets, the alarm call of a jay, the signs that warned of an approaching enemy. They were no longer rescuer and rescued. They were partners, their skills and their knowledge forged into a single weapon for the war they knew was coming. Amidst the grim preparations, in the heart of the growing darkness, Jedediah found a moment to cling to a different kind of future. One evening, after Taza was asleep, he retrieved the bolt of blue calico he had bought in redemption. He had kept it wrapped in canvas at the bottom of his supply chest. He unrolled it and held it out to her. The simple, cheerful pattern of small blue flowers seemed impossibly bright in the dim, fire-lit cabin. Nita looked at the fabric, her face filled with a complex mix of emotions. She touched it hesitantly. Her deerskin dress was a connection to her past, to her people, to the woman she had been. This cloth was from his world, the world that had taken everything from her. To wear it felt like another kind of surrender. "For you," he said softly. He held up a blanket to give her privacy. She disappeared behind it, and the cabin was silent for a long time. When she stepped out again, the breath caught in his throat. The dress was simple, crudely sewn by her own hands. But on her it was transformed. It followed the graceful lines of her body, the soft blue a startling contrast to her dark skin and hair. It softened the warrior's edges, revealing the woman beneath. Yet it could not hide the unyielding strength in her eyes. It was a vision of a life he had never thought to have, a life of peace and quiet beauty. She went to the small, cracked piece of mirror he had nailed to the wall and stared at her own reflection. Her expression was one of profound sorrow, a quiet mourning for the woman who was gone forever. But as she looked, a tentative acceptance began to dawn in her eyes, an acknowledgement of the woman she was now. Jedediah moved to stand behind her. Their eyes met in the mirror. "You are beautiful," he said. The words were simple, unadorned, but they carried the entire weight of his heart. She turned to face him, and in that moment, in the fragile quiet of their fortress home, they allowed themselves to dream. They allowed themselves a small, desperate glimmer of hope for a future that seemed impossible, a life where they could simply be a man and a woman, a family. They clung to that beautiful, fleeting hope, even as they both knew the darkness was gathering just outside their door, preparing to tear their world apart. The storm came from the west, a bruised and purple wall of cloud that swallowed the setting sun whole. It did not arrive gently. The wind came first, a low, mournful howl that grew into a physical force, bending the tall prairie grass flat and tearing at the shingles of the small cabin. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets that turned the yard into a churning sea of mud and blurred the world beyond the windows into a gray, watery chaos. Inside, the three of them were an island of fragile warmth against the storm's fury. Jedediah had barred the door and shuttered the one window he had not boarded over. A fire crackled in the hearth, its light pushing back against the encroaching gloom. Taza was asleep on his small pallet, a deep, trusting sleep that seemed a miracle in such a violent world. Nita sat by the fire, sharpening the flint heads of her arrows, her movements economical and precise. Jedediah was cleaning his rifle for the third time that day, his hands moving with a grim, practiced familiarity. They did not speak of the fear that hung in the air between them, as palpable as the scent of ozone from the storm. They both knew that this was a night for endings. A storm like this was a gift to men who moved in darkness. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a sudden, sharp sting of cold air. The small pane of glass in the main window, the one Jedediah had left unshuttered, exploded inwards, showering the floor with glittering shards. Before the sound of the shattering glass had even registered, the deafening crack of a rifle shot echoed from the storm, a sound barely distinguishable from the clap of thunder that followed it. In an instant, the fragile peace was annihilated. Jedediah kicked over the small table, upending it to create a crude barricade in front of the window. He dropped to one knee behind it, the heavy Winchester already at his shoulder. Nita was on her feet, the bow in her hand, Taza's sleeping form behind her. She moved to the narrow firing slit on the opposite wall, melting into the shadows. Another gunshot ripped through the night, the bullet thudding deep into the log wall just above Jedediah's head, showering him with splinters of wood. The siege had begun. The world outside was a maelstrom of wind, rain, and impenetrable darkness. They were firing blind, aiming at the muzzle flashes that bloomed like malevolent orange flowers in the storm. Jedediah returned fire, his shots methodical and deliberate. He was not trying to hit anything specific. He was trying to show them that this cabin was not a soft target. The roar of his rifle inside the small space was concussive, a physical blow to the ears. Gunpowder smoke, thick and acrid, began to fill the room, mingling with the wood smoke from the hearth. From her position, Nita was a creature of absolute stillness and deadly purpose. She did not waste arrows on the muzzle flashes. She waited, her senses attuned to the chaos outside. A bolt of lightning split the sky, and in that brief, brilliant flash of white light, the world was illuminated in stark detail. She saw them. Half a dozen figures hunkered down behind the corral fence and the woodpile, their faces pale and demonic in the instantaneous light. She drew her bowstring back to her cheek. The motion was as smooth and natural as breathing. She held her aim for a heartbeat, then released. The arrow hissed into the storm, a whisper of death lost in the roar of the wind. There was no answering cry, no satisfying thud. But when the next flash of lightning came, one of the dark shapes behind the corral was gone. The fight devolved into a brutal, chaotic rhythm. Flashes of lightning, the roar of gunfire, the answering thunder, the relentless drumming of the rain. Jedediah worked his rifle with grim efficiency, ejecting spent cartridges, feeding fresh ones into the chamber, firing into the darkness. He felt a strange, cold calm settle over him. This was it. The final reckoning he had known was coming. The ghosts of his past were silent for once, replaced by the immediate, screaming reality of the present. He was not just defending a piece of land. He was defending the flicker of a future he had dared to hope for. Another bolt of lightning lit the yard, and in that momentary glare, Jedediah saw a man break from cover, running low towards the blind side of the cabin. Jedediah swung his rifle, but the man was too fast, swallowed by the darkness before he could get a shot off. A second later, a rifle exploded from a new position, closer, the bullet tearing through the wooden shutter and ricocheting off the stone hearth. Jedediah shifted his position, exposing himself for a fraction of a second to get a better angle. It was a mistake. A muzzle flash bloomed from the direction of the barn, and a white-hot poker of pain slammed into his left shoulder. The impact was like being kicked by a mule. It threw him backwards, his head cracking hard against the log wall. The rifle clattered from his numb fingers. For a moment, the world dissolved into a gray haze of shock and agony. A roaring filled his ears that had nothing to do with the storm. He tried to push himself up, but his left arm was a dead, useless weight, and a hot, wet stickiness was already soaking his shirt and spreading across his chest. He gritted his teeth against a wave of nausea. "Jedediah!" Nita's voice cut through the fog of his pain. He saw her face then, her eyes wide with fear, but her hands were steady as she knocked another arrow. He forced himself to his knees, his vision swimming. "I am all right," he lied, his voice a hoarse rasp. He fumbled for his pistol with his right hand, the world tilting crazily around him. Seeing him hit, seeing the man who had shown her such impossible kindness fall, something inside Nita broke. The cold, controlled warrior vanished, and in her place rose a fierce, protective fury. These men would not take this from her. They had taken her husband, her people, her home. They would not take this man. They would not take her son. She became a whirlwind of deadly motion. She sent an arrow into the darkness towards the barn, another towards the woodpile. She was no longer waiting for the lightning. She was listening, sensing, her hunter's instincts taking over. She heard the crunch of a boot in the mud too close to the wall and sent an arrow hissing through a crack between the logs. A choked, gurgling cry was her answer, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the wind. She was no longer just defending. She was attacking. She was fighting not just for survival, but with a burning, righteous hatred. During a sudden lull in the shooting, a new and more terrifying threat emerged. A strange, flickering orange light began to dance outside the boarded-up window near the hearth. Then came the smell. Acrid smoke, sharp and choking, began to seep through the walls. They had set the cabin on fire. The smoke thickened with terrifying speed, pouring in through every crack and crevice. It was a living, malevolent thing, burning their eyes, stealing the air from their lungs. Taza woke up coughing, his small body shaking with terror. Nita rushed to him, pulling him into her arms, pressing his face into her shoulder to shield him from the worst of the smoke. "It is all right, my son. Be brave," she whispered in their tongue, her voice a calm anchor in the growing chaos. The heat was becoming intense. The log wall where the fire had been set began to glow a dull, angry red. They were trapped. To stay inside was to suffocate or burn. To go outside was to face the guns of Silas Croft and his men. Jedediah struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the wall, his face a pale, sweat-sheened mask of pain. His vision was starting to tunnel. The blood loss was making him weak, dizzy. "We have to go," he choked out, his words punctuated by a racking cough. "The door!" Nita looked at him, at the dark, spreading stain on his shoulder, at the fire eating its way through their shelter, at her terrified son. The choice was no choice at all. She ripped a piece of cloth from her dress, soaked it in the water bucket, and tied it around Taza's face. She did the same for herself. She helped Jedediah to his feet, his good arm slung over her shoulder, his body a heavy, sagging weight. He held his pistol in his right hand. "On my count," he gasped. "I will go first." He took a deep, shuddering breath, then lurched towards the door. Kicking away the heavy iron bar, he threw the door open and stumbled out into the pandemonium of the storm. The world was a living nightmare of fire, rain, and mud. The side of the cabin was now fully engulfed in flames, the roaring fire a stark, horrifying contrast to the dark, driving rain. Jedediah fired his pistol twice into the darkness, the shots sounding pathetic against the roar of the elements. He was a beacon, a target, drawing their fire so Nita and Taza could get out. A bullet whined past his ear. Another kicked up a spray of mud at his feet. He staggered towards the relative cover of the horse trough, his legs threatening to buckle with every step. He fell to one knee behind it, his remaining strength draining away with his blood. And then Silas Croft was there. He emerged from the swirling rain like an apparition, a big, hulking shape, a cruel, triumphant smile plastered on his face. "Well, Thorn," he boomed over the storm. "Looks like your little family reunion is over." Jedediah tried to raise his pistol, but his arm felt like it was filled with lead. Croft kicked the gun from his hand, sending it skittering into the mud. "You should have stayed out of my business," Croft sneered, looming over him. He drew a large hunting knife from his belt, the blade gleaming in the firelight. "I am going to enjoy this." Jedediah braced himself, a wave of profound despair washing over him. He had failed. He had brought this destruction down upon them. He could only hope that Nita and Taza had made it to the cover of the creek bed in the confusion. Croft lunged, but Jedediah was not a man to die on his knees. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he threw his body forward, tackling Croft at the legs. The two men went down in the churning mud. A tangle of limbs and curses. It was a primal, desperate struggle. Croft had the size and strength. Jedediah had the fury of a dying man. He drove his head into Croft's face, rewarded by the crunch of cartilage. Croft roared in pain and rage, bringing the hilt of his knife down hard on Jedediah's wounded shoulder. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded through Jedediah's body. His vision went black. His grip slackened. He was finished. Through the rain and firelight, he saw Croft raise the knife high, its point aimed at his heart. He saw the hatred in the man's eyes, the final, brutal victory. Then, something impossible happened. A soft, wet thump. Croft's eyes went wide with shock and disbelief. The triumphant smile on his face slackened. He looked down. The feathered shaft of an arrow protruded from the center of his back, just below the shoulder blades. He made a strange, gurgling sound and pitched forward, his heavy body landing beside Jedediah with a wet smack in the mud. Jedediah twisted his head, his vision swimming, and he saw her. Nita was standing near the corner of the burning barn, the bow still held in her hand, her face a mask of terrible, beautiful ferocity. In the chaos of the fire and the exit from the cabin, while he had been the diversion, she had not fled. She had circled. She had hunted. The remaining two men, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. They fired a few wild shots into the night and then vanished, their running footsteps swallowed by the storm. Silence fell, a profound, ringing silence broken only by the hiss of the rain on the burning logs and the mournful howl of the wind. They had won. Jedediah lay in the mud, the rain washing the blood and grime from his face. The strength that had sustained him through the fight, the last dregs of adrenaline and sheer will, finally deserted him. The world began to fade, the edges of his vision closing in. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him completely was Nita, her bow dropping from her hand as she ran towards him across the muddy, fire-lit yard, her face a beautiful, terrible vision of love and fear. The dawn was a slow, reluctant witness. It broke gray and weeping, the sky the color of old ash, revealing a world washed clean and brutalized by the storm. The rain had finally softened to a cold, persistent drizzle, and the wind had died to a mournful whisper through the scorched logs of the cabin. The fire was out, quenched by the deluge, but a third of the small structure was a blackened, skeletal ruin, gaping open to the sorrowful sky. The smell of wet soot, churned mud, and the metallic tang of blood hung heavy in the air. Nita stood in the doorway of the remaining section of the cabin, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and surveyed the devastation. Her world, for the second time, had been reduced to wreckage. The bodies of the three men lay where they had fallen, grotesque and still in the muddy yard. Silas Croft's face was pressed into the muck, the arrow a stark, feathered declaration of his end. The sight brought her no triumph, only a deep, bone-weary sadness. Violence had answered violence, and all it had left behind was ruin. Her gaze shifted to the man lying on the floor inside. Jedediah. She and Taza had managed to drag him out of the mud and into the driest corner of the cabin, away from the smoldering wall. He was alive, but only just. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper in the quiet room. He was unconscious, lost in a place she could not reach, his face pale and clammy beneath a sheen of feverish sweat. The makeshift bandage she had tied around his shoulder was soaked through with a terrifying amount of blood. Fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but she pushed it down. There was no time for fear. Fear was a luxury for a world at peace. This was a world of survival. She looked at her sleeping son, curled on a pallet near the hearth, his small face peaceful in a way that felt like both a blessing and an accusation. She was the only thing standing between him and the end of the world. She was the only thing standing between Jedediah and the grave. The knowledge did not break her. It forged her. She became a creature of pure, focused will, using the knowledge passed down from her mother and her mother's mother, a legacy of wisdom carried in stories and songs. She took control. She sent Taza, when he woke, with a small bucket to the creek, telling him to bring back only the clearest water from upstream, away from the battlefield. While he was gone, she ventured into the rain-soaked prairie, her eyes scanning the ground. She knew this land in a way Jedediah never had. She found yarrow, its feathery leaves perfect for staunching the flow of blood. She dug up the thick root of the purple coneflower, a powerful defense against the poison of a festering wound. She gathered willow bark for the fever and the leaves of a broad-leafed plantain to draw out the fire and pain. Back in the cabin, she worked with the focused intensity of a healer, She boiled the water Taza brought and gently, painstakingly cleaned Jedediah's wound. It was worse than she had feared. The bullet had torn through the muscle and sinew of his shoulder, a ragged, ugly hole that was already inflamed, the edges of the skin a dark, angry red. She ground the coneflower root into a paste and packed it into the wound, then covered it with a poultice of chewed plantain leaves and bound it all tightly with fresh strips of cloth torn from her new calico dress. She brewed a bitter, potent tea from the willow bark and, lifting Jedediah's head, managed to trickle some of it past his lips. For days, the world shrank to the size of that small, smoky room. Time became a cycle of tasks, changing the dressings, forcing sips of tea and broth into Jedediah's mouth, keeping the fire alive, and watching. She watched his breathing, listened to the fever words he muttered in his delirium, felt his forehead for the slightest change in temperature. Taza was her silent, solemn assistant. He brought her clean rags, fetched more water, and sat for hours by Jedediah's side, his small hand occasionally resting on the man's uninjured arm, as if his touch alone could tether him to the world of the living. Jedediah drifted on a dark, burning sea. He was lost in a fever dream, a landscape of ghosts and fragmented memories. He was back in the small, stifling room where his wife and daughter had died, the air thick with the smell of cholera. He saw Martha's face, her eyes pleading with him to do something, to fix this, but his hands were empty, useless. He felt Sarah's small body go limp in his arms, a weight that was both impossibly light and unbearably heavy. He cried out their names, his voice a raw, broken thing. One night, as Nita was changing the cool cloth on his forehead, his eyes fluttered open. They were glassy with fever. Not truly seeing her, he looked at her, but it was another woman he spoke to. "Martha," he whispered, his cracked lips forming the name like a prayer. "I am sorry. I could not save you." The name struck Nita with the force of a physical blow. A sharp, unexpected pain lanced through her heart. She was the one here, the one fighting to keep him alive. But his soul was with another woman, a ghost from a life she could never be a part of. For a moment, she felt like an intruder, a stranger tending to a love that was not hers. The bitter sting of it brought tears to her eyes. But then she looked at his face, at the genuine anguish etched there, at the way the fever had stripped him of his stoic defenses, revealing the raw, unhealed wound of his grief. And the pain in her own heart softened, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He was not rejecting her. He was mourning the pieces of himself he had lost. She, who had lost everything, understood this more than anyone. His past was a part of him, just as her own past was forever a part of her. To love him was to love all of him, including the ghosts he carried. Her love for him, in that moment, deepened into something fierce and unconditional. She gently wiped the sweat from his brow. "Rest, Jedediah," she whispered softly. "I am here." On the fourth day, the fever broke. He woke to the quiet crackle of the fire and the low murmur of Nita's voice as she spoke to Taza. He felt weak, as if all the strength had been scoured from his bones. But his mind was clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He tried to sit up, but a bolt of agony from his shoulder sent him falling back with a groan. Nita was at his side instantly, her hand gently pressing on his good shoulder. "Be still," she commanded softly. "You have been very sick." He looked around the cabin. He saw the ruined wall, the empty space where the window had been, the soot stains on the ceiling. The memories of the attack came flooding back, chaotic and terrifying. "Silas!" he rasped, his throat dry. "He is gone," Nita said, her voice flat. "They are all gone." Slowly, over the next few days, as his strength began to seep back into him, the full reality of their situation settled in. His left arm was a useless appendage. Nita's medicine had saved his life and prevented the loss of the limb, but the damage was too great. The muscles had been torn beyond repair. He would never again have the full use of it. The knowledge was a bitter pill for a man who had built his life on his own self-reliance. The homestead, his refuge, was barely habitable. The fire had taken a third of the cabin and most of their winter supplies. More importantly, it was no longer a refuge at all. It was a crime scene. Silas Croft was a powerful man. His absence would be noted. Men would come looking, and when they found 3 dead white men and a homesteader living with an Apache woman, they would not stop to ask questions. The law, in this part of the country, was a tool of the powerful. It would never side with them. The hatred that Silas represented had not died with him. The conversation happened one evening, as he sat propped up by the fire, watching Nita mend a tear in Taza's shirt. The quiet domesticity of the scene was a painful illusion. "We have to rebuild," he said, his voice quiet but stubborn. "Reinforce the walls. Dig in. I will not be run off my own land." Nita stopped her sewing. She looked at him, her dark eyes full of a sad, weary wisdom. "What land? Jedediah? This small piece of dirt? Is it worth our lives? Is it worth Taza's life?" "It is my home," he insisted, a touch of his old pride in his voice. "We fought for it. We won." "We survived," she corrected him gently. "That is not the same as winning. I have seen this fight before. My people fought for their home. It was a land they had lived on for 1,000 years, a land of sacred rivers and ancient trees. They fought and they died, all of them. The land is still there, but my people are gone. A home is not the dirt under your feet or the logs in a wall. A home is the people you protect." Her words, spoken with such quiet, devastating certainty, stripped away the last of his stubborn pride. She was right. He had been so focused on defending a place, a symbol of his past, that he was willing to sacrifice the future. He looked at Taza, who was tracing patterns in the dust on the floor, and he looked at Nita, her face illuminated by the firelight, her strength the one solid thing in this ruined world. He had not just survived a gunfight. He had been given a second chance at life, a second family. To stay here would be to throw that gift away. The decision was a stone in his heart. To leave meant abandoning the place where he had tried to bury his grief, the place where he had built his lonely kingdom of solitude. It meant leaving the ghosts of Martha and Sarah behind. But Nita was right. True survival was not about defending a piece of land. It was about finding a place where their new, fragile family could finally live in peace. "All right," he said, the words feeling like a surrender and a liberation all at once. "We will go." They gathered what little they could salvage. The work was slow and somber. They packed jerky and flour, a small bag of beans, their water skins, Jedediah's rifle and pistol, Nita's bow and arrows. They had so little, yet it felt like enough. As he was packing a canvas sack, Jedediah's hand brushed against the small wooden horse on the mantelpiece. He picked it up, its smooth, worn surface a familiar comfort. For a moment, he thought of leaving it, of closing that chapter of his life for good. But he could not. It was a part of him, a part of the man he was, the man Nita had come to love. He carefully wrapped it in a piece of cloth and tucked it deep inside the sack. They took the 2 best horses, Jedediah's buckskin and a sturdy mare, the other 2 he owned. He led from the corral and slapped them on the rump. "Go on," he said, his voice thick. "Be free." The horses stood for a moment, confused, then trotted off towards the open prairie, a final, poignant severing of his ties to this place. The final scene was painted in the stark, clear light of a new morning. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, scrubbed clean by the storm. Jedediah, his arm in a sling, was helped onto Dust's back by Nita. She then swung up behind Taza on the mare. The 3 of them, a broken rancher, a warrior woman, and a small, solemn boy, sat on their horses and looked for a last time at the ruined homestead. It had been a place of profound sorrow and unexpected love, a crucible that had burned them down and forged them into something new. Then, without a word, Jedediah turned his horse. He did not look back. Nita and Taza followed. They rode west, away from the rising sun, towards the vast, unknown territories. A wall of purple mountains shimmering on the distant horizon. They had no destination, no map, no plan, but to keep moving. Their love, born of tragedy and tempered in violence, was now their only compass. The story did not end with a promise of a happy ending, but with the quiet, unbending strength of a new family choosing life, choosing love, and riding together into the vast, unforgiving heart of the American West. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. And do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel to share your thoughts with us in English.